All right, welcome everybody to the Danish Institute for International Studies and today's seminar on Trump and the future of transatlantic relations. My name is Jakob Linde-Schmidt and I'm a PhD fellow here at DIIS. An easy conclusion to draw is that Trump is unpopular in Europe. As the figure next to me shows, Europeans would have voted for Harris if they could. But it also shows that Western European populations are more skeptical of Trump, while Eastern Europe is more divided. Going a bit deeper, especially voters of mainstream political parties view US and European interests and values as divergent, whereas some of Europe's right-wing parties see Trump in a more positive light. That said, Trump's return as president of the US did cause uncertainty and concern in most European capitals. In terms of security and defense, Trump was expected to further emphasize the need of a burden-sharing shift. He had long expressed an intent to reduce the US commitment to Europe in favor of turning over responsibility for European security to Europe. In addition, he had expressed ambitions for a quick end of the war in Ukraine and changes in trade relations between the US and Europe. Hope that Trump's second term would be similar to his first quickly burst. His apparent inclination to accommodate Putin, the chaotic meeting with Zelenskyy at the White House, Vance's criticism of Europe in his speech at the Munich Security Conference, the will to start a trade war with Europe, and and the threats to possibly annex Greenland, just to name a few, showed that the Trump administration was indeed divergent from mainstream European views on a number of important issues. Trump 2.0 is apparently different from Trump 1.0, and the Europeans are indeed having a Trump moment. A survey of 9 EU countries showed that less than 10% saw Trump as a friend of Europe, whereas more than half of them saw him as an enemy. But Europeans' view of the US were already changing before Trump's return. For some years, we have seen decreasing number of Europeans viewing the US as an ally sharing interests and values, whereas viewing the US as a necessary partner has been increasing. At the same time, we are seeing increased support for enhanced European cooperation. This begs the question whether we are witnessing just another temporary crisis in the transatlantic alliance, whether this marks the beginning of a fundamental different relationships, or perhaps even the end of the transatlantic alliance as we have known it since the end of the Second World War. The aim of today's seminar is to bring perspective on this important question. First, my colleague Rasmus Sinding Søndergaard will give a presentation on the Trump administration's view on transatlantic relations. Then Christine Nissen from think tank Europa will give a presentation on developments in the European Union. Afterwards, there will be time for questions. Rasmus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for showing up. I'm going to talk about the America problem that we have here in Europe. Trump is a big part of it, of course, but I'm going to try and give a little bit of context to that. So I guess my first point will be crisis, challenges, differences across the Atlantic is, as you probably know, nothing new. We could go down the list from the Suez crisis from '56, de Gaulle's skepticism of NATO in the early 60s, protests like these across Europe against what some people would characterize as US imperialism or general opposition to various wars and elements of US foreign policy throughout the years. Vietnam, of course, chief among them, but also later with the Iraq War in 2003. But also other issues that we know all too well these days, like questions of trade in the 1980s, disputes over trade, disputes over placement of nuclear missiles in various places in Europe. I mean, the list is long, and this will not be a history lesson. I just want to say, before I turn to the orange elephant in the room, that there has always been disagreements, and not to sound like a politician, but yet we have always overcome them so far. Now, this time, as some of you might think as well, might be different. So, Trump, on the one hand, is but the latest example in a long list of challenges, controversies across the Atlantic. However, he is, as I'm sure many of you will agree, also unique. Basically, unlike any of his predecessors from 45 onwards, unlike any of the crises that I mentioned just before, Donald Trump represents the first US president to sort of fundamentally question the value of the transatlantic alliance and the foundation that the alliance rests upon. This is new. And so how is this done? Well, obviously there's his style. Also, if we just leave substance a second to side for a while, there is his style, which obviously is quite different. We always hear he's unpredictable. He's also very transactional. And I would argue he's highly personal. All of this means that those things that used to be central to transatlantic dialogues, such as shared history, shared values, and also processes that we agreed on, how do we do these things, how do we communicate with each other, those, as you have all hopefully noticed, they're all out the window now. So Trump is just a different beast. He acts in a completely different way, which means that the challenge is different and unprecedented. Then there's the substance. I already alluded to it. He does not take the role as leader of the free world, or you could say sort of, the policeman. He essentially doesn't give a damn about the rules-based order. And again, this is new. And we can point to all these examples throughout history where various US presidents have not lived up to the commitment to a rules-based order, where they have not followed the norms and the rules that they would like to have the rest of us play by. But the difference is that Trump fundamentally does not even believe that this order should exist. Not for him, but not for anyone else either. And Greenland, of course, is the obvious example. If you can seriously suggest that you can alter borders and violate state sovereignty just because you'd like to expand your own country's territory on the map, clearly you are not someone who cares too much about the rules of the rules-based order. Another thing that's different and unique is he does not have any appreciation for the concept of collective security. Obviously, here I'm talking about the Article 5 guarantee in NATO, but I'm talking about it more broadly as well. Unlike any of his 1945 predecessors, from 45 onwards predecessors, Trump does not see US national security as fundamentally interlinked with European security. From 1945 up until Trump, there has been a consensus among American leaders, among American policymakers, at least the presidential level, that war in Europe affects US security, and there's like an interlinked collective security relationship between Europe and the United States. For Trump, NATO is an insurance policy. It's a simple transaction. You give something, you get something. Then there's the break with the commitment to free trade. On Monday, of course, the 15% tariffs go into effect on all European goods exported into the US, with some exceptions and all that, but general rule, right? That is also different. There's always been instances of protectionism and constant sort of back and forth across the Atlantic about whether to increase or decrease various tariffs and regulations on trade and all that. But Trump's approach is fundamentally different, as you've seen, which is like a complete sort of abandonment of even trying to move towards free trade and instead moving towards greater protectionism. Then there is his views. This is maybe the most obvious difference from him and his predecessors. his view on Putin. I mean, the way that Donald Trump talks about Putin, his recent frustration aside, the way he talks about Putin and other strongmen, and conversely, the way he talks about European leaders from democracies, EU institutions, is just so different from anything that we've seen from previous US administrations. Of course, there's been criticism. I mentioned Iraq as an example where there was friction. But, I mean, Trump, when you come out and say that the EU was created to, quote, screw the United States, that is just something completely unprecedented in US approach to Europe. So again, Trump is unique in this regard. And so, that's the message here. He's unique. He is the first post-1945 president to sort of really truly question this alliance, this transatlantic relationship. So, before I get to the America problem, I therefore have to say a few words about the Trump problem. I've already started going down that road, but if you just sort of narrow in on three key challenges that we have in what I use the short term is, of course, like another 3 years, so it's pretty long, but still, I'm a historian, so for me 3 years is short term. So the here and now, we have three challenges, right? And they're going to come as no surprise to you if you've been paying attention, right? We have a security issue, which is the main one. We think maybe, probably not correctly, but seem to think that we settled that one in The Hague. We had a, under the circumstances, positive NATO summit where there was agreement on spending 5% on GDP on defense. But I think you have to be a bit naive if you don't think that there's still questions around the credibility of US security guarantees to Europe. And of course, the other side of the security dilemma is the question of Ukraine. And as we've seen with the summitry recently in Alaska and Washington, Ukraine has the potential to completely blow up the transatlantic alliance in security. Because any day now, we may have a falling out between the Europeans and the Ukrainians on the one side and the Americans on the other side on how to solve the situation in Ukraine, especially if the Russians and the Americans try to force a peace on Europe that is not sustainable and not acceptable to the Ukrainians and the majority of the Europeans. So the security, sort of settled for now with the Hague summit, but really not, and still something that could blow up. The second one is, of course, trade. Again, it was settled, supposedly, with the agreement. Now we know that we're going to have to pay 15% in tariffs for stuff that we export into the US market. But I also want to caution there, of course, because as we know with Donald Trump, any agreement can be brought back up again and is subject to renegotiation. And right now it seems that tech, regulation of tech companies, social media, etc., seems to be, from Trump's recent his recent tweets, seems to be something that could very quickly escalate into another trade-related question. So basically the Americans do not want us to regulate on EU level on many of the US tech companies, right? So that could also very quickly become not settled and reopen to a confrontation that could lead to an actual trade war. Then there's the third component, which is maybe even more difficult to settle, and that is the question of different values. Now, Jakob showed it very well, that there are parts of Europe, of course, in all European countries, some more than others, that are quite aligned with the Trump administration on values. So I'm not going to pretend like there's like a block where there's like Europe and then there's Trump. There are, of course, certain elements of European politics that are sort of more aligned with the sort of MAGA perspective. The problem when it comes to values here is that people in and around the Trump administration has interfered in European domestic politics on a number of occasions. Jacob mentioned Vance's speech in Munich at the Security Conference, but you could also point to US criticism of various issues in the UK. There was the question of the election in Romania, and I'm sure very shortly we'll find more examples where people in the Trump administration or around its orbit interferes in various ways in domestic politics in the United States. And I should say that when you speak to some of the MAGA people in the US, they also believe that Europeans do the same thing, specifically when Zelenskyy went to the US during election season. The Republicans, some of them, of course, were very quick to point out that they saw this as some form of interference on behalf of the Democrats by, in their words, campaigning with the Democrats in Pennsylvania ahead of the election. So at least the accusations of interference go both ways. I would argue that on the substance, there was quite a big difference here. Anyways, the values thing and the interference is very unlikely to be settled, for there's no way that Europe can present a deal that will satisfy Trump there, unless, of course, we adopted the values of the MAGA worldview. Okay. So, the short term. We have averted these crises before, and maybe we have averted it for the time being with the NATO summit and with the trade agreement. But I think it's a very unstable truce rather than a peace or rather than a settlement. So I think we all agree that we remain in crisis mode. And obviously the case of Greenland these days illustrates that all too well. So my final remarks, and this is what the talk has been building up to, is to say that we talk a lot about Trump, and I've just highlighted why Trump is unique and why he represents a challenge to Europe. But what's more interesting to someone like me is the sort of more long-term challenge, which is essentially that Trump, as has often been said, is a symptom, but he is not the cause of what we're witnessing in the United States. There is a change in the American approach to Europe that has been underway before Trump and will carry on after. Now, Trump is unique in many ways, but if you just zero in on a few important points, we'll see that it's more than just Trump. There is an America problem, if you want to call it like that. And I should say the reason why we have an America problem is, of course, that Europe on many issues is not able to act on our own. So America is not so much our problem. We ourselves are our problem because we're dependent on America, right? If we weren't so dependent on the US, what the US does or doesn't do is less consequential for us, of course. But the one thing that's pretty obvious, even if it hasn't manifested completely yet, is the so-called pivot to Asia. The strategic shift where the United States from 1945 and up until fairly recently viewed Europe as the most important region in the world, where they first and foremost directed their attention and their resources. Well, now Asia has taken over as the most important region because China, of course, to most Americans, appear the sort of most formidable opponent rather than any European power. Then there is the issue of trade. Now, I mentioned that Trump is unique in his love of tariffs, but it's important, of course, to note that the sort of mood swing, the shift on trade is much broader than Trump. One example is, of course, that Trump imposed tariffs on China and then Biden decided to keep them in place. And although the Democrats and the Republicans differ on how to deal with it, Trump is buy America, America first, and the trade wars. But for the Biden administration, it was foreign policy for the middle class and a foreign policy that was focused on securing also jobs and helping American economy thrive. There is both of them have issues with the way that globalization has been pursued so far. And so there is a broader trend in the US that is a move, not an absolute move, but a relative move from free trade to greater degrees of protectionism, which means we'll have to contend with a US that is going to be less open to our exports in the future, regardless of the president. Then there's another general phenomenon, and that is the sort of growing, what I call it, fatigue, I would say, with the role of being the global policeman, right? So there is across the political spectrum, not in all of the American population, but there is a growing fatigue with forever wars, as some like to call them, but foreign military interventions, nation buildings, and in general this notion that the US should intervene around the world and try and sort of sort out the problems as this sort of policeman figure. It's not an absolute shift. Trump, of course, likes to fashion himself the deal maker and is very busy around the world, supposedly making peace. So it's not isolationism, but it is a lack of appetite for the sort of policeman work that they have been doing until fairly recently. Another thing, and I'm coming to my conclusion now, is the change in the Republican Party. So it used to be that you would have Democrats and Republicans, and they would be liberal and conservative versions of some form of internationalism. They might have different views on the UN, etc., but generally, though, there was a foreign policy consensus, bipartisan consensus on the big things. Well, now we have a Republican Party that has become conservative nationalist rather than conservative internationalist. And it's pretty clear, to me at least, that we're not going to have John Bolton back as the National Security Advisor anytime soon. So we're looking at the Republican Party in the foreseeable future pursuing a foreign policy that is much closer to Donald Trump than, say, George W. Bush. So that is going to be a challenge, because that means that the US is going to be more unpredictable, because who wins the presidency will have a greater impact on the foreign policy, because we will have one party that will have completely different views on the rule-based order, climate change, the EU, for instance, much more critical on those issues among the Republicans for the foreseeable future. And that is my main message here to the end, that we have a Trump problem now, but we're going to have an America problem for a long time to come. Thank you. Jeg napper altså den her. Jeg har drukket den.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation and following up on Rasmus's excellent presentation. I'll try to take us through how this Trump problem and the broader America problem, what that means for Europe and the EU, and what the EU is doing about it. Because summarizing Rasmus's presentation very quickly, we can say that for Europe, this Trump problem, the America problem, the long-term version of that, means one thing for Europe, and that is the end of old certainties, right? I read a very recommendable op-ed this morning by Mario Draghi, who has recently written what has become this Bible in at least the EU European bubble, stating everything that is wrong with Europe, and also some notes about what to do about it. But this and this week he made a little follow-up op-ed where he said that for Europe to survive, we have to stop being a spectator to world events that are directly impacting our own trajectory, and definitely, and we need to start leading our own fate. We have heard that before, right? Also from Draghi, but from many others as well. And it seems like a reasonable quest that we, in this situation that Rasmus has just described, need to do more stuff on our own. This microphone is a bit weird, but I hope it works well. At least you in the room can hear what I'm saying, so that's good. Anyways, it seems like a reasonable quest that Europe steps up and do more on its own. And at the same time, it's actually an incredibly hard thing for Europe to do. And why is that? Let's take a step back. Because Europe is right now facing Europe took a bet after the end of the Cold War that we now see has failed. We have basically built our security model, but also our welfare model on American security. Rasmus mentioned how the problem, it's maybe straightforward, but nevertheless important to stress the problem. The reason why Trump and the American problem is such a big problem is because we are very much dependent on American security. We also took a bet after the end of the Cold War as to how the world would develop, namely in a peaceful way. And that's why we became independent or dependent on stuff like Chinese goods or Russian energy. We truly believed that dependence on others, friends, like the US, but also foes like Russia or China, was the way to go. Because in a world where we were dependent on each other, that would be a more safe world and a more prosperous world. That was the bet that we took after the end of the Cold War, and that is the bet that we now see has failed. And when it comes to security, which is sort of the focus of my research interests, we had two very basic constants of the European security order, which was the American security guarantee, and then this idea of some type of perpetual peace on the European continent. And those constants that were the very basis of our security architecture are now gone, or at least not as sort of secure as we thought. We still, however, have this dependence on the U.S. for protection, and that also means that we do not have a security order that makes us act on our own. We have realized, since we no longer have a peaceful continent, that we need to do much more on security and defense, but we have a structural security problem too, namely that since we've been so dependent on the US, we have and Putin has invaded Ukraine, so we have shipped off that little military material that we had left on the shelves. Now we have empty shelves, but we also do not have the production lines or the production capacity to build up our own defense industrial strength. And there's no quick fix to that problem. And that goes back to why it's really difficult for Europe to change our course, because it's more than just a politics question. It's not just about day-to-day politics. It's also about changing some of the norms and values and belief systems that Rasmus also mentioned, because this very basic belief that dependence was a good thing now need to be seen from a very different perspective. That's obviously easier said than done. Europe must change fundamentally. What's better than an Einstein quote, right? You can't solve the problem with the ways of thinking that created it. And this is a problem that needs new ways of thinking that is up in the air right now. Europe must change quite fundamentally. And when it comes to security and defense, we do have both an EU and some EU member states that are trying to adapt. And I was also asked to sort of zoom in on the EU as an institution when it comes to the transatlantic link and this problem of security that is quite an overarching problem, a dilemma of our time today. And here we do see that the EU and its member states are trying to adapt to this new, very difficult reality. There are a lot of new instruments and strategies coming out of Brussels these years and months and even weeks. We have quite an alphabet soup. The EU is good at that. So I've listed a lot of different initiatives, but nevertheless, these all cover the idea to try to fix this structural production problem, that we do not have the necessary military tools and capabilities, and we do not have the capacity to produce them ourselves. So it's much less about operationalized force. It's not about creating an EU army. It's about creating the sort of industrial structures to make Europe stand more on its own feet. We have also seen the European Commission. It's not that long ago that the European Commission and the EU as such had very little to do with EU or defense as such, but this is really changing. One turning point was Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but a more significant one was the re-election of Donald Trump. So a lot is happening there. We have a month ago, the EU Commission came out with a new budget proposal where they suggested to spend 5 times more than is the case today on defense. So the EU budget used increasingly on defense. And here the focus is, very much on sort of factories, weapons, production lines, making Europe think more as a war economy than this peace project it was once created to be. But of course, there are quite a lot of problems. The threats that Europe are facing are not only territorial or traditional in a military sense. They're also very much hybrid. They're also very much happening right now, today. And then, of course, defense is still national. So we have a situation right now where defense is national. Threats are both conventional, but they're also hybrid. And the tools we have does not fit the problems that we are facing. We also see, obviously, quite a surge when it comes to willingness to spend much more. But we still have some very fragmented ways of doing defense spending and procurement in Europe. And we also have quite a lot of European states that looks differently on, for example, threat perceptions, where to spend money and how to go about these challenges, which are the most important challenges. As Macron has quite interestingly put it, there are quite a big difference between those citizens in Europe that worry about the end of the world and those who worry about the end of the month. Because in this new situation that we are in right now, where we can think less about sort of how to have nice and cheap welfare and more about those big pressing global challenges. We also need our citizens to sacrifice, and this is something new to ask at least for the last couple of decades. So it is really a fundamental change, both at the political level, but also at the level of the general public. And here we have a Europe that both needs to answer to those who worry about the end of the world and those who worry about the end of the month. And I will end soon, but I'll say, and this I've talked about, we have a lot of challenges and at different levels. And then what will the future hold? I will not come in and predict the future, but I'd say that obviously a key factor in terms of how Europe will react is political will, and I think we do have quite a united Europe, despite these many differences across European capitals and also those sort of fractions away from the capitals. But we do have a united Europe, and we do have, although it's only a partial prospect, however you look at it, a stronger coordination, a stronger EU on some levels, and also still a lot of fragmentation. So I think that we'll have some different processes going on at the same time. We'll have much more coordination, a much stronger, also at an institutional level, including that of the EU, but we'll also see processes and even increase in fragmentation across Europe. We do, of course, also might see a alternative scenario where those current, that sort of institutional setup that we have built when it comes to security in Europe, NATO and the EU, are simply not fit to meet the challenges of today. So we need to do a bigger rethinking of how we organize ourselves in Europe. And on that sort of a happy note, I will end, so we also have time for the fun stuff, namely questions from you. Thank you so much. Jakob, where do you want us? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Christina and Rasmus, for your presentations. And as Christina just said, we will now open the floor for questions. So it's your time to ask your questions if you have any, and our experts will try to comment on them. And I recommend that we will gather a couple of questions. So please raise your hand and state your name and affiliation.
Thanks. My name is Nikolai Lunø. I'm a retired organizational psychologist. A friend of mine who has some understanding of economy points to the fact that where there is a recent agreement that the EU should spend 3.5% on military spending plus 1.5% on defense-related spending, Mario Draghi's report suggests that the EU should also spend 4.5% of BNP on technological innovation. On top of that, the EU has committed itself to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine after the war, plus including a number of new member states, etc., etc. And my friend rejects the idea that the spending for defense purposes will have a very big spillover effect on the technological innovation in general. So my question is, if these things are true, has anyone done some hard thinking on how to solve these problems? And if so, who are they?
Hello, my name is Carsten Paludan-Müller. I'm affiliated researcher at Cambridge University. I have a question about the thing that you ended your presentation about, which was the possibility that Europe or EU would have to reshuffle, to reorganize itself. As I see it, it's how could that be avoided? I mean, we've seen that decision processes are stalemated time and time again by single member states. Hungary is a very good example of that, which produces the effect that Europe cannot respond in time and keep up with the development as it accelerates. So how would a new architecture look? What would be the role of major powers and of minor powers? Should we envisage Europe in different sort of modes or circles of influence and commitment? We need also to expand Europe, talking about new member states. So how do you balance that against the need for better decision processes so that Europe can actually take a new position where it is not an object of other powers' decisions? Thank you.
Great. Let's hear from our experts on these two questions first, and then we'll gather a number of more questions afterwards. Christine, will you begin?
Sure. Excellent questions. Easy questions. So thanks. Okay, let me start with the last one because it's not on. Okay, sorry about that. Let me start with the last question. I find that very intriguing myself. If it wasn't also so depressing. I think it was Finland's president, Alexander Stubb, who I heard say recently that an answer to that question, or a way that it would be structured, at least in a sort of near future, perhaps a future which is already here, is that we'll have, and this is mostly in relation to the EU and not so much NATO, but of course it relates. We would have an EU plus and we would have an EU minus in terms of structuring the path forward. The EU plus would be outside the EU institutions as such, but still interlinked to what is going on there right now. And here, non-EU members such as Norway, but notably also the UK and also Ukraine, would move forward when it comes to security and defense integration in a way where these countries are integrated in. For example, we talked about the capabilities problem that we have, where the EU and some sort of internal markets is playing a role there in terms of building new capabilities. And here it would, and then of course there are questions of operational strength or cooperation, and here we cannot see as a future without these countries. And then there would also be an EU minus, where we at the same time have a core inside the European Union that becomes different than it is now. We do have a situation where key member states are blocking everything that goes on. For example, Hungary as an outlier that is often mentioned, but there are also other member states that feels has similar positions. And here we do see an increasing norm where a decision making is being done in a bit of a different mode. We in a more informal sense, where we move a bit beyond sort of, for example, the veto right that governs the EU security and defense policy. So a short answer to your question is that we would undoubtedly, and we already see other configurations within the EU framework and also outside it, because we do have a setup where the EU is not sufficient, and we do have a very difficult, obviously, situation in the NATO framework as well. And maybe I'll leave the sort of NATO European pillar NATO question to you, Rasmus.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was a NATO question, but it was a good question that your friend has been doing some thinking on how does these numbers add up? How are we going to pay for all of this? I don't know who's... Yeah. Yeah, or compared to the US, where the economic area in Europe was compatible to the North American or the American like 20, 25 years ago, and now we have lagged behind tremendously. One way to help us have more money to spend, of course, would be if we had greater degree of free trade with our most important partner in the West. But so the tariffs are not helping. And say if you're an American who wants the Europeans to spend more on defense and pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine, one could argue that hitting them with tariffs is not very smart. But that's an aside. I think one small thing that might help with making the math add up is, of course, that the 5% of on defense, as you also said, 3.5 plus 1.5. Why is it 5? Because Trump wants it to be 5, not because we need to spend 5. So I would say that without Trump in the equation, there's maybe a solution where we spend 3.5 on our defense and spend it more wisely and do the things that Christine mentioned with the EU, where it has to be more sort of EU-wide investments where it's interoperable and where it actually spend it more wisely, right? That would be a way of getting more money, for more value for your money. That's, of course, again, easier said than done, but I don't think we're going to be spending 5% in 3 years. I just don't think so. Some countries will, of course. Some countries are already moving towards it, but on an EU level, we won't spend 5%. I think maybe 3.5 is much more realistic, and if you spend it wisely, it should be sufficient, as I understand it, to achieve the military objectives. So that takes 1.5 out, but it leaves us still with a very big check, especially with the war in Ukraine. And I could say that the best way to minimize the cost of rebuilding Ukraine is, of course, to more proactively work to end the conflict now so that we can get out of the fighting phase and into the rebuilding phase a bit sooner. But, of course, that also has to do with what happens in Moscow and not just what happens here.
Just maybe a very quick add to that in terms of your question. I think you're completely right, and one thing that is I think everyone agrees on is that we need to spend more wisely, because now it's really not the case. There are 27 different defense systems across Europe, and one thing that is gaining ground these years is common procurement. So the idea that not everyone needs to have everything in the military garage. We could have pull and share a little bit, and also produce more in Europe, which would, in a longer term perspective, also make sense if we do it to a larger degree together. And then one thing in this Mario Draghi, because you mentioned him yourself, op-ed I read this morning, he also mentioned that in order to make the money add up, because you're absolutely right, then he said that you cannot, you have to also get used to the idea that we need common depth in Europe. We need to borrow the money. And we also need to rethink the way that we do this. So, for example, one thing that he, and I'm not an economist, so I'll only sort of say what his thoughts are, and what the EU has presented as an option is both this idea of common depth, but also the idea of rethinking the EU budget. So the EU, for example, has its own resources, form its own taxes in order to get more money at the European level, because if we just do it as we have done until now across 27 member states, then the money won't add up.
I think we have time for just a few more questions, but please keep it short. Yes?
Hi, Andreas Busk-Bunde. I'm an economist from Copenhagen University and current AI student at the University of Southern Denmark. So I'm thinking there's the old saying of opportunity threats, and so that the change doesn't have to be a threat, it can also be an opportunity. And I know von der Leyen said early on that Europe is open for trade, and the Danish foreign minister said also a month ago that we should emphasize more on trade with Africa. So maybe we could try to turn the negative sentiment toward US into a positive sentiment of furthering trade with other countries like Canada or Africa or whatever. So, because I think in theory, in the mid to long term, the protectionist should be the greatest loser.
Take one more question.
I have three very short questions. The first is on the first figure that you showed. I wondered why, what was the criteria for the countries which was included, and especially several European countries were excluded, and what was the criteria for that? Secondly, I have a question on diplomatic relations, especially appointment of ambassadors. US and Trump has appointed Ken Havery as new ambassador to Denmark with a very clear duty on promoting US interest. What's the case in other ambassadors to European or appointed ambassadors to European countries? And thirdly, this year marks also the 50th anniversary for the Helsinki Treaty. And from that also the CSE and OSCE, they are also part of, in fact, of the transatlantic relations. But do you have any comment on the present situation of OSCE, and could it be a sort of alternative transatlantic relations that the one you see between US and the European Union?
Just to start with the question on the survey, so it's a reproduction, so I don't know what the exact criteria were for which country were included and not. But Rasmus, would you?
I'll take a couple of the last ones there, and I'll leave the trade one to you. But I'm assuming you'll say something about Mercosur or something. No, okay. On the diplomatic relations, on the incoming ambassador Ken Havery. Well, he is, as most U.S. ambassadors to small European nations, a political appointee, which means he doesn't have sort of a long career in the foreign service as a trained diplomat. Those are at the embassy as well, at the level just below him, of course. However, of course, he is interesting because he was the former U.S. ambassador to Sweden, so he's not unfamiliar with the region. He's also interesting, of course, because he has close connections to many of the sort of prominent tech people in the US and Silicon Valley, including the tech people on the sort of tech right, you could say, as well as close connections to the Trump administration. So he's an interesting figure in that regard, and it's no doubt that he's appointed because he needs to implement Trump's agenda with regards to Greenland, right? But he is not a career diplomat. He is an appointee. That's kind of important to remember, I think. So that's the normal procedure, right? That's what we've had always in as far as I can remember, here in Copenhagen and in most European capitals of like smaller countries, we have political appointees. Some of them with little experience or poor maybe connections to the administration, and others like the incoming ambassador here with some experience from his previous position, but also with very close ties to the Trump administration. So he's an interesting, potentially very powerful ambassador. And I think it's both his connection to Trump, but also to the tech industry that's very interesting in this regard. On the Helsinki thing, very briefly, I mean, the OSCE that grew out of the CSE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, that was the Helsinki process. That organization, of course, was, by the end of the Cold War, in theory, an alternative to NATO expansion and the security architecture that we now have. It has become, since less relevant, if I'm being diplomatic, but it could have been another avenue. It's a road that wasn't taken, where you had a different architecture for European security and cooperation. Will it come back? I don't know. I want to say just one thing about your alternative scenario, where the existing institutions can't handle the new problems, and therefore we need to come up with new ones. I mean, that's an old one you could revise. I think there's also a scenario where the existing institutions can't handle the new problems, and so they become irrelevant and fall apart, but they're not replaced. We didn't talk about the bad one, but that's the bad case, right? I think that one is actually worth contemplating, even if it's like a dark road.
Dark but realistic road. Yeah. I agree. Just one very short comment on that positive note, because it would be nice actually to end this session on a positive note. There are not many of them right now, it seems. But you're absolutely right that this would be a good way for Europe to follow. It would be a dangerous way for Europe to turn inwards in the current situation. And that is right now the dividing line. It's the big dilemma. Do you replace this dependency path with sovereignty that means that we become inward looking? Or do we replace it with something else? And obviously we cannot do without allies, even though our sort of former big brother, best friend might have turned its head away from us. We need to look other ways. That makes a lot of sense. And as Rasmus pointed out, we do have a Europe and an EU that actually is going down that path, trying to get new trade relations running with other parts in the world. And this is a very key strategy to further engagement with those countries that Europe shares values with, but also others, furthering and deepening trade relations with other parts of the world. So absolutely, I think this is the way to go personally, but that's not that important. It's also very much the way to go as seen from the perspective of Brussels and most of the capitals in Europe. Thanks.
And on that note, I guess time's up for today, but thank you very much for coming, and let's continue the discussion another day.